fail better. How to set up and run an investment fund or a hedge fund in the 21st century. This could have been called smart investing in the 21st century, or judgment without bias. But instead of that, it was called superforecasting. So who are superforecasters? Well, they are the 2% of the population who have exceptional judgment. They're not perfect, but they are significantly better than the rest of us. Now, the key takeaway of this book is that you need to learn to keep score. You need to gather feedback. And you can think of it like this. An optometry test without context is meaningless. You need a control. You need a benchmark. Now, I'd add one further point. I'd say it's important also to measure the right things. If you're familiar with Bill James, if you're familiar with Moneyball, then this will make sense to you. If not, then you'll have to go look him up. 4 questions. Who's on the bus? You need to screen for aptitude, smart, engaged, numerate, but more important than that, you need to screen for character. You need people who are humble, open-minded, conscientious, curious, self-critical. Confidence and ignorance sometimes go hand in hand, and it can be mistaken for certainty. Now, who's on the bus can be a metaphor for your influences, who you listen to, or it can physically be who's on the bus. What framework are you using to keep score? You need to be able to forecast, obviously. You need to be able to measure the outcomes of those forecasts over time, and you need to let people revise those outcomes because the future hasn't happened yet. And finally, you need to let people repeat. 2 reasons for that. You need to collect all of the data, find out who's a star, who isn't. And secondly, we learn through accelerated feedback loops. Repetition. Any good coach is going to want to know, once you've got credible baseline numbers, how do you improve on those? Now, I want to talk about bias briefly. Bias, if you don't know what bias is, it won Danny Kahneman and Richard Thaler the Nobel Prize a few years ago. They invented a whole new field. You might have heard of that. It's called behavioural economics. Cognitive biases. Now, there's a number of these, and they're unconscious. We're not even aware we're doing it. And it skews our judgment. The first bias I'm going to talk about is confirmation bias. It's a quote by Mark Twain. It ain't what you don't know. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so that's going to get you in trouble. It's a confirmation bias. Anchoring. A few years ago, a Bitcoin was worth $18,000. Now it's worth $6,000. Now that $18,000 is an anchor because the $6,000, that looks like a bargain now. But there's no reason a Bitcoin should be worth anything at all. Might be worth 100,000, it might be worth 0, you just don't know. Try to avoid falling into a groupthink bubble. Present bias and availability bias, we overvalue the here and now. You need to stand back and look at the big picture over a long time frame. Attention bias. We identify with simple emotional stories. Complex, logical stories are hard work. The framing effect. If you put a face that people know, like and trust, then you amplify that message. The best ideas don't always win out. Sunk cost and endowment fallacy. If you ever played poker, then you are dealt in on the small blind and the big blind. Now, you have no obligation to pay to see another card. If you've got a bad hand, if you've got a middling hand, lay it down. The gambler's fallacy. A deck of cards, a roulette wheel, has no memory. Loss averse. We feel the pain of loss more than the thrill of victory. If I was to propose a bet for you, take £100 out of your wallet, I'll take 100 out of mine, and flip a coin. If I win, you give me 50. If you win, I will give you 75. Now this seems like a no-brainer. You should take that bet. However, people don't take that bet, because on the way home they'll be kicking themselves if they've lost 50 on a flip of a coin, whereas the 75 feels like found money. Now, in order to make you take that bet, I'd have to offer you 100, and this has all sorts of implications. The why question. Now, some people will say, if it ain't broke, why are you trying to fix it? And that'll bring a smile to some people's faces. And maybe the correct answer is, it is broken, you just haven't noticed. You might remember DEC, Digital Equipment Corporation, a contemporary of IBM. Now, they predicted that the personal computer would never make any headway. You'd never see, there'd be no need for personal computers. Microsoft predicted that the iPhone would gain no significant market share as a $500 luxury item. Maybe you've been cornered by a gold bug who's bending your ear about quantitative easing, printing money. Now, economic theory says that it must lead to inflation. 10 years has passed and what we approached was, we had deflation. It didn't work out. If you've ever tuned into Bloomberg, now usually for me they put a little guy with a bow tie on, and he'll be interviewing an oil analyst. Now this oil analyst will be taking his lap of honour as oil's just crashed through $100. Now the next stop is $200. Oil's not going to stop. 6 months later you tune back in and oil's at $30, and there's a bearish analyst. Oil is going to zero. It's got no chance. We will never see $50 oil again. Now that one particularly annoyed me, but it's because I'm a value investor, and I believe in the long term things turn up. And it's reckless to write things down to zero. Now, if the picture I'm painting rings a bell, I'm mixing my metaphors there, then Philip Tetlock is your man, because 25 years ago he conducted some research, and he concluded that expert judgment, expert political judgment, investment, intelligence was no better than average. Or as he rather colourfully put it, it's comparable to a dart-throwing chimp. However, there are 4 reasons to have sympathy for the deaf. The first is that forecasting, predicting is hard. It's really hard. You have to deal with red herrings, you have to deal with fake news, you have to deal with outright fraud, you have to deal with mistakes, missteps, people misspeaking, and none of it is within your control. You are simply a passive observer. You're only as good as the information that you receive. Secondly, this is a numbers game. In poker, if aces in a race beat kings 80% of the time. However, 20% of the time, 1 in 5 times, a third king will drop and aces will lose. There's nothing wrong with your reasoning, but you lose. You should guard against outcome biases, because it will prevent you from pursuing the same thought processes that led to what was the correct decision, but the wrong outcome. Keeping score sounds great in theory, but in practice, it's not so great. I value invest. I invest like a pension fund. I take conviction positions, small positions, on stocks that I will hold forever. Now, if they are in the news cycle, negative, and their stock starts plummeting, starts cratering, then I will read everything I can about that situation. And if I conclude that that storm will pass in time, then I will buy more shares. I will average down. Now, if you compare me to a day trader, you compare me to a swing trader, you compare me to most of the market, then I'm not going to look great. It's not going to be a good comparison for me. Sometimes Philip Tetlock's dart-throwing chimp is just a distant speck in my rearview mirror. But over time, 18 months, 2 years, if I buy enough stocks, then things should even themselves out. This is Buffett's investment principle. It involves a lot of hard work, a lot of reading. an awful lot of judgment calls. And finally, risks and incentives. We discussed the coin tossing example, but let me apply it to, let's say 20 or so people are running investments, and they're each given the same choice that I gave with the coin toss. Now, most people turn it down, but some people will take that bet. Now, if they get it right, then they get 75 back, and they get a pat on the back, perhaps a small promotion, a raise, a bonus. But if they get it wrong, they get the sack. So there's no incentive to take the risk that you need to make outsized returns. Now, I'm told all good speeches, you tell them what you're going to tell them, you expand on the details, and you tell them what you've just told them. So that's what I'm going to do here. Who's on the bus? You need to look for a grit and growth. A growth mindset are people who are open-minded enough to challenge their convictions. They're not set in stone. And a grit is they're willing to update their beliefs over time. If it is broke, and it's obvious it's broke, try not to surround yourself with people whose first instinct is to shoot the messenger and bury the body. You're not running a crime syndicate here. Your aim is to get at the truth. Not obscure the truth, not extend and pretend. Smart people sometimes are the dumbest people. There's a handful of people in the world who can count into 2 decks of cards without any special training. However, there's an awful lot of people who think if they simply apply themselves, then they could crack the code. Now, you don't want to waste your time forecasting anything that is impossible. No point in measuring it, no point in allowing people to revise, no point in repeating the process, because accelerated feedback loops aren't going to work if it's impossible. You're simply spinning your wheels. And finally, if the facts change, you need to be willing to change your opinion. You can take all that information, all that data that you've gathered from your forecasting tournaments, and you can feed it into an algorithm, and that will tell you where people's strengths are, where people's weaknesses are. Assign people with certain strengths to certain teams. Then ask everybody to make a forecast. Weight those forecasts according to strengths and weaknesses. Aggregate everything, and you have one final step: you need to amplify. World-class poker players will tell you that if you are not going to regress to the mean when you get a good hand, you need to maximise value. You need to amplify. If you don't, then you're not going to beat Philip Tetlock's Dark Throne chip. You're going to regress back to the mean.